All right, well, as Joel mentioned, the theme this semester is the Bible true? And what we've been doing as an evangelical Christian organization, we've been making a case trying to give good reasons and evidence to believe that, in fact, the Bible is true. Tonight we're going to talk about potential mistakes in the Bible. This is one of the most common objections, of course, you'll get when you make the claim the Bible is true. People might ask, well, what about the errors? Or what about the mistakes that people have said are in the Bible? Well, tonight we're going to consider the idea of inerrancy. It's kind of a big word. It's not something we use on a normal day-to-day conversational basis. But basically all the word means, biblical inerrancy, is the idea that the Bible has no errors. You can kind of see that in the word error, and the in front of it would negate it, so no errors. We are claiming, at least Ratio Christi as an organization is claiming, that the Bible has no errors. But like all of the claims that we believe in, we have to defend that. We have to give good reasons and evidence why we believe that. So that's what we're diving into tonight. Let's do a little bit of review first. I think this will be helpful to kind of walk through some things we've already discussed in this semester, which has led us to this point. If you remember very much at the beginning of the semester, we said that there's two senses in which you could ask whether or not the Bible is true. Now, in both senses, we're using the correspondence theory of truth, okay? We're not sneaking in some other different idea of truth here. When I say there's two senses of true, don't think that I'm somehow jumping away from the correspondence theory of truth. No, we're using truth the same way in both senses. By true, we just mean something that corresponds to reality, right? That's just the normal understanding of true or truth that we use, right? So when I go to my bank account, or I go to my teller and I say, how much is in my bank account? I want to make a withdrawal. And they say, you've got $200 in your bank account. I say, well, is that true? And what I'm meaning by that is that what really corresponds to reality? Is it really 200? Is that a fact according to what's actually real in reality? That's the sense in which I'm using the word true here, in both 1 and 2. So the distinction I'm making is, first of all, is the Bible true in the sense that it's historically reliable about the major events? Maybe in this sense there are some minor mistakes, but for the most part the major events are historically reliable. It's kind of like this. Let's say your friend got in a car accident, right? And they're telling you about the car accident and how it happened and who hit who and who arrived on the scene right away. And let's say in the midst of them telling you the story, they said the car that hit them was black. Whereas in fact, in reality, it was a dark blue car that hit them. So their account, their story has a mistake in it, not a lie, but they were just mistaken. It has a mistake in it. But for the most part, we would say, their account of the accident is historically reliable. We're not going to dismiss the whole thing because they were mistaken about the color of the car a little bit. Does that make sense? So in this sense, we're asking the same thing about the Bible. Even if it does have some mistakes, is it for the most part historically reliable about the major events? The second sense in which we could ask, is the Bible true, is this. Is it completely correct in every single detail, major and minor? So back to the friend example. Let's say they did get the color of the car right, and let's say everything that they describe about the accident is exactly correct. That's not out of the realm of possibility, right? We do make mistakes, but let's say they got everything right. Then their account would be absolutely correct. So you see the differences. So we could ask the same question of the Bible. Is it true in this sense? It's absolutely correct in every detail. Now, as we've talked about this semester, really only the first one is necessary for Christianity to be correct. So if these major events did happen, I think we've pretty much established Christianity, even if there are some minor mistakes in the Bible. I mean, if Jesus really rose from the dead, I would say that's Christianity in a nutshell. It confirms that he was God in the flesh, and it confirms his claim about how to be reconciled back to God, forgiven for our evil choices. Even though I think number one is all that's really necessary for Christianity to be true, we are making the case this semester that, in fact, the Bible is true in both senses. So that's our position officially as an organization. Not that everybody who comes to Rancho Christi believes this, of course, but as the leadership and the officers would affirm that the Bible is true in both senses. Now, not all Christians do. In fact, a very famous Christian that we've all probably read and enjoy and respect doesn't believe the Bible is true in the second sense, and that is C.S. Lewis, of course. So you can envision here three different positions on this issue. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to discuss the following question at your table. Give my voice a break here. What events in the Bible must be historically true in order for Christianity to be true? Christians disagree on this issue, so I'll let you guys chew on this for a few minutes at your table. Give you some examples. You can think of many more, I'm sure. But what major events do you think must be historically true in order for us to say that Christianity is true? All right, go ahead. I'll give you a few minutes. Well, as you can imagine, even among Christians, there's disagreement on this question, and I'm not going to try to solve this by any means. I would just say personally that I think all of these things are historically accurate and took place in reality in history. But even among people in the room and among Christians, there's disagreements as to what, first of all, what really did happen in history and what is necessary to have happened in history in order for Christianity to be true. We've also mentioned this semester that these two senses of the Bible being true require different arguments. So the first sense of the Bible being true, that it's historically reliable about the major events, maybe has some minor errors, but for the most part historically reliable, requires an inductive argument or an empirical argument. So this is something we spent a lot of time on last semester in the fall, making the case with historical evidences that these major events did in fact happen. For the second sense of the Bible being true, and that it's completely correct in all details, an inductive argument just won't work. Why is that? Well, because there's a lot of statements in the Bible that just can't be empirically tested. There's some statements that are about things that happened so long ago in history, there's really nothing left for us to be able to verify it really happened or not. And there's a lot of spiritual or statements about the spiritual world that we just don't have access to for the most part in order to verify their truth or falseness. Empirically, that is, right? So for the most part, to make the second case, it requires a deductive argument. And we did that. I'll run you through it again real quick. Right? Number one, God exists. Number two, sometimes God communicates to human beings through other people, i.e. prophets. Therefore, there are some people, true prophets we call them, that really do have messages from God. Now, some people claim to have messages from God, but they really don't. False prophets, if you will. Now, the way that we can tell the difference, the main way, the biggest tool that we have, so to speak, in our toolbox of knowing who really has a message and who doesn't, is if they can do miracles. This is something we're going to spend the whole night on next week. But, at least for this argument, premise 5 says miracles helps us know the difference between true and false prophets. This is the inductive aspect, or the empirical aspect. There's good historical evidence that these major events did take place. So even this deductive argument for the Bible being completely true is built on an inductive premise. In fact, the premise from the first sense of the Bible being true, that in general it's historically reliable. 7, there's good historical evidence that Jesus and his disciples said the books in both the Old and New Testament are messages from God. Therefore, we can conclude that they are. 9, this will be the key premise we'll be looking at tonight. God can only tell the truth and can't make any mistakes. So, if these really are messages from God, and if premise 9 is correct, it follows logically then that the Old and New Testament are completely true in all details. At least this is the deductive argument that has led, I would say, the vast majority of Christians to conclude that the Bible is completely true in all details. Okay, it's a deductive argument. As we talked about, I think 2 weeks ago now, the key here, which guarantees its truth, is inspiration. So this idea that God somehow moved or inspired the biblical authors to write what they wrote, not in a formal dictation sort of way, but in an inspired way, he moved them to write exactly what he wanted them to write. And it's that inspiration process, because these are messages from God, that guarantees their truthfulness, because I think it's reasonable that a perfect being could not make any mistakes. If there is such a perfect, supreme being, such as we understand God to be. So just an example of this, right? One of the many verses we looked at, which teaches this idea of biblical inspiration. Here you have Jesus telling his disciples how God, the Holy Spirit in this sense, is going to help them when they write these things down, to write them down truthfully. So this idea of inerrancy, this idea of the Bible being completely true, isn't something we just came up with, just an idea as Christians we came up with. We're seeing this in the text itself. Okay? So yes, we have our deductive arguments, but we're building them from the premises we find in the text. So as you can imagine, even among Christians, there is a lot of debate and discussion about this idea of inerrancy. It can be sometimes it can be referred to as an in-house debate. Okay, obviously non-Christians aren't going to think the Bible is true in either senses for the most part. So then you have Christians who, agree on the major events on the Bible, but then they disagree as to whether the Bible is truly inerrant or not. Well, all of that debate, all of that discussion kind of came to a head in 1978. I'm sure before all of you lovely people were even born, I believe. Not before I was born, though. 1978. In 1978, this discussion was getting so heated that a bunch of evangelical leaders met together in Chicago. Weren't we just saying that Chicago is such a wonderful place over dinner? Yeah. Another reason why. Chicago. They met in Chicago, maybe because it was central, I don't even know. But they met there to try to hammer out this doctrine, or to hammer out a statement that they could all agree to. Now, as you can imagine, when you get 4 evangelicals in a room, you've usually got 5 opinions, right? That's just how things work. We debate and disagree on a whole host of issues. Baptism, communion, end times, how to interpret Genesis, literally, allegorically. All sorts of differences among these evangelical leaders, coming from various denominations, right? But they came together to try, as best as they could, hammer out a document that they could all stand by and agree to. And they succeeded. The document that they crafted there is referred to as the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. People like Norman Geisler were there. My hero of the faith, Francis Schaeffer, was there. R.C. Sproul, Presbyterian, was there. So J.I. Packer was there. A lot of big names in the evangelical world. Unfortunately, a lot of them have passed away since then. Well, this document, the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, has kind of become a standard document within at least the evangelical community. It's become one of those documents that's served a very helpful purpose because it's something that we can just quickly and easily refer to see if we're on the same page. I'll give you an example. So I got connected with a seminary in Germany. And at the time I was looking to teach, and at the time they were looking to have somebody come and teach philosophy and apologetics for a month every year. And this was something that I was interested in, serving, right? Doing this in Germany every year for about a month, going over there and teaching at this seminary. This was about 4 or 5 years ago now. And we were feeling each other out, right? Because they wanted to make sure I wasn't a heretic or crazy or I had doctrine that didn't match up with them. And I wanted to make sure the same thing. I mean, this is another country, completely different side of the world. I wanted to make sure that, we kind of fit together, at least theologically on the major points. And one of the ways we were able to do that is just to say, hey, they said to me, hey, do you affirm the Chicago Statement? And I said, well, yes, I do. And I asked them the same thing. Do you affirm the Chicago Statement? And they affirmed, yes, we affirm the inerrancy as laid out in this statement. And then, within 30 seconds, we knew for the most part we were on the same page when it came to our understanding of the Bible. Now, there's obviously some minor theological differences between me and the seminary, but that put us on action made by Christians, and you'll see that makes sense. So a non-Christian probably wouldn't make this argument. But those Christians who disagree with inerrancy, this is one of their arguments. And I want you at the table to discuss, is this a good argument, a bad argument? How would you respond if somebody made this argument to you? So some Christians would say inerrancy isn't true because the word inerrancy is not found in the Bible. So go ahead, chat on that for a few minutes. Well, in my opinion, I think this is one of the worst arguments against inerrancy. So I don't want to, make the mistake of building up a straw man. There are Christians who reject inerrancy, and they have much better reasons for it than this. This is one of the bad reasons or bad arguments against inerrancy. When folks make this argument, I have come across this many times. When I talk to somebody who's making this argument, usually what I do is I say, you know what? Even the word God is not found in the Bible, technically. God is actually an Old English word, comes from Norse mythology. Odin is the root, Odin, Thor. It's just an English word that we use generally for a supreme being. It's not found in the Greek New Testament. It's not found in the Hebrew Old Testament. It's just a word we use to refer to the general idea of a supreme being. Same thing with the Trinity. Trinity is as a word found in the Bible. It's not the word that's important or the term we use. It's the idea. Is the idea of a supreme being found in the Bible? Of course it is. We just use the term God to mean supreme being. Is the idea of a Trinity found in the Bible? I think so. And we use the term Trinity to refer to that idea. You want another word? That's fine. You don't like the word inerrancy? Call it snowfluga. I honestly could care less what term we use. It's the idea that the term means. Another thing we discussed over supper is that language is very fluid, and you have to oftentimes define your term or define your word because it can be used differently by different people. So as long as we define the term, we can use any term we want. All right. Now, this Chicago statement, one thing that it doesn't do, it doesn't go through every potential error in the Bible and explain or address that potential error. That's not what this statement does. I want to kind of explain to you what this statement is and what it does, because I think it does something very helpful, but it doesn't do that. There's several versions of the statement. There's a short version that only has 5 simple points. You can find all these versions online, of course. And here's just an example of one of these 5 points. Here's point number 4. I won't read it. You can do it if you'd like. There's also a long version, has 19 articles, right? This is what inspired Joel to write his resolutions. So this one's much longer, of course, 19 articles. And they also produced a full-fledged book, if you want to go that in-depth, to fully explain their position. And it was written by R.C. Sproul. So what all of these different versions do of the Chicago Statement of Errancy, what they're attempting to do is to clarify what they mean by inerrancy. What does it mean when we say that the Bible has no errors? Now, this is very helpful because there is mass confusion out there among Christians and non-Christians about what we're claiming. And so these documents just help explain exactly what we're claiming when we say the Bible is inerrant. And I want to go through some of these clarifications because I think they'll be really helpful. And in fact, these qualifications or clarifications help knock out the vast majority of those potential errors, or what people claim are errors in the Bible. So we're going to go run through a list, and it's quite extensive, but I think it'll be helpful for you. And these are all qualifications or clarifications about what we mean when we say the Bible is inerrant. Here's one thing that we're not saying, okay? So as Christians, when we say the Bible is inerrant, we're not saying that our interpretations of the Bible are inerrant. Now, some pastors need to be reminded of this. It's very important to distinguish between the Bible, which we're saying has no errors, and our interpretation of the Bible, which certainly we make mistakes and errors in that. I know that I have, and I'm sure that I still am making mistakes in my interpretations. I try not to. We all strive to interpret it accurately as best we can. But we're not inerrant. We're not inspired. We make mistakes. And even among those who were there in 1978, as I mentioned, had many differences in their interpretation of the Bible. Here's something else that we're not saying. We're not saying that the Bible approves everything it records. I think this is vitally important to clarify because the Bible includes a lot of nasty stuff. I mean, let's face it, there's some rated R sections of the Bible. But we're not saying the Bible condones those things. What we're saying is that the Bible accurately records those things and that those things truly did happen. Not necessarily that it's approving those things. Here's something else we're not saying. When we say the Bible is inerrant, we're not saying that all the statements in the Bible are technically precise by modern standards. Look, when you're watching, by the way, you guys, maybe the younger generation doesn't know this, but there's a nightly program every night at 10 o'clock called The News. And the older generations, they watch that to get information about the world. Just so you know. Now, let's say you're part of that older generation, you watch the news, and the weatherman says that the sunrise this morning took place at 6:42 a.m. Now, I guarantee you're not going to jump off the couch and throw something in the TV and scream out, "Liar, he just made an error. The sun doesn't rise." Technically, yeah, that is an error, I guess. But that's not how we think, and that's not how we accuse other people of lying or making an error. That's just how we speak, right? That's just a common, everyday, non-technical way of saying that that's when we first saw the sun, right? So the Bible is written for the everyday man. The Bible is written for the common person in all generations. And so it speaks quite often from just a common observational standpoint. So it says things like sunrises and sunsets. But, and here's the key point here, a source doesn't have to use scholarly, technical, Western terms in order to be true. That's the point we're trying to make here. Okay, another thing we're not saying with this idea of inerrancy, we're not saying that the copies of the Bible are inerrant. We've spent a lot of time talking about how we don't have the original books of the Bible anymore, right? Those have been lost in history. All we have are copies. And we're not saying the copies are inerrant. In fact, we've talked a lot about that here in Ratio Christi, that these copies are full of copying errors, full of copying mistakes. Side note, we can recreate the original with a high degree of accuracy, right? According to that Princeton professor, Dr. Bruce Metzger, we can get back to the original, not perfectly, but with a very high degree of accuracy. However, we're not saying that the copies are inerrant. We're saying that the originals are. The originals which, obviously we don't have anymore. Those are what we're claiming are inerrant. Important point to make here. In fact, I want you to discuss something about this at your table. Here's a question that often comes up in this conversation. In fact, I just saw it come up in a debate between Michael Licona and Richard Howe, I believe. Two Christian, very well known in the apologetic community, both of them. And one of them leans more heavily towards inerrancy, and the other one affirms inerrancy, but maybe not quite as strongly. And so they were having a debate, discussion up on stage, and the following issue came up, and this comes up a lot. So I want you to discuss it at your tables. Here's the question. If copies of the Bible, with errors, as we admit, are sufficient for us, then why would God have to inspire errorless originals? Obviously, we don't need an errorless Bible, because we use Bibles that have mistakes and errors in them for our devotions and our sermons and our church services, right? Our copies have mistakes. So it doesn't seem like we need an errorless Bible. An error-filled Bible seems to be sufficient. Therefore, why did God have to inspire the originals to be inerrant? So I'll let you chew on that for a few minutes at your table. Go ahead. All right, let me respond to the question real quick. I think we can do it fairly simply. And overhearing some of your discussions, I think you guys were landing on this as well. It's not necessarily what we need or what is sufficient for us. That's not the key question here, okay? Certainly, we all agree that evidently a Bible with some errors is sufficient for us. That's not really the issue. The issue is more about what God can and cannot do, right? So the reason God had to have inspired errorless originals is not because we needed it, but it's because as a perfect being, he can't make a mistake. So he couldn't have, if our logic is correct here, he couldn't have inspired messages that had errors if he wanted to. Because as a perfect being, you can't do anything imperfect. So it's not about what we need or what is sufficient. It's more about what God can and can't do. Okay? Okay, here's something else we're not saying when we claim inerrancy. We're not claiming that the Bible contains all truths. I think this is fairly obvious to most people. The Bible really is a fairly short book. It doesn't contain every true propositional statement ever, right? All we're saying with inerrancy is that what it does say are errors. Okay? Those are literary devices that we all use to make a point powerfully. Thankfully, the Bible isn't a glossary. How boring would that be? No, the Bible uses these literary devices very well. Now, of course, sometimes these things can contain errors, right? If you let's take an exaggeration, right? Now, an exaggeration can push too far, can be an error or even a downright lie. But usually when somebody exaggerates, you know not to take them literally, right? Usually when you use exaggeration or when somebody uses exaggeration, you know that they're making a point. Not a technical, literal point, but just a point about something in a powerful way. I'll give you an example, Acts 17. In Acts 17, the Bible is explaining what happened to Paul, and Paul finds himself in Athens, in Greece, the capital and birthplace, literally, of philosophy, at least Greek philosophy. And the Bible in Acts 17 explains that the philosophers there in Athens did nothing else but sit around and talk about new ideas. Now, obviously, that's an exaggeration. They clearly did more things in life than just sit around and talk about new ideas. They probably ate from time to time. They probably slept. So certainly this is an exaggeration about these guys, but it's done to make a point. Nobody takes it literally. Therefore, it's not an error. Okay, moving on. It's important to remember, this is all from the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy. I'm just kind of paraphrasing and summarizing some of the articles and points. It's important to remember that when the Bible quotes something, we talked about this last week, it's not necessarily implying that everything in that source is correct. All it's saying is that the statement in the quote is correct. Another famous example from Acts 17. In Acts 17, the Bible, through Paul, quotes some Greek hymns which were written about Zeus. Also important to remember that it's not an error to paraphrase or to summarize. In fact, that's what I'm doing tonight. I'm paraphrasing and summarizing the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy for you tonight. And I'm not doing anything in error, at least I don't think I am. You can check out the statement for yourself and see, even though I'm not giving it to you verbatim, I am capturing, hopefully, the intent of the authors appropriately. It'd be the same thing, if you had a friend who came to you and they had just heard a speech by the president or somebody, and they summarized that speech or paraphrased an important point, but didn't give it to you verbatim, well, that wouldn't be an error. You wouldn't accuse your friend of making an error or lying. And the same thing is the case with the Bible. Just to give you one example, Sermon on the Mount, probably the most famous sermon in history, certainly the most famous sermon in the Bible, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, 3 chapters. You can sit down tonight and read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' famous sermon. You can read that sermon, probably take it 5, maybe 10 minutes. Do you really think Jesus only preached for 10 minutes? I highly doubt Jesus was one of those type of preachers. I can almost guarantee you, don't know with absolute certainty, but I can almost guarantee you that the original Sermon on the Mount was probably hours long. And so what we have there, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is simply a summary of it. Might not even be any verbatim quotes in there from Jesus, but simply Matthew's summary, which is not, according to this document, Chicago Statement, is not an error. It's important to remember that bad grammar ain't an error. As I said earlier, language, grammar is not absolute. It's not objective. Language, grammar is so fluid. It changes literally on a daily basis. New words, new meanings to words, words that flip-flop in meanings, grammar rules, up, down. When I started seminary, I had to follow all these rules. Chicago Turabian, SBL. And by the time I finished my degree, half of those rules had changed. These things are not objective absolute truths. Language is very fluid. So, you want to point out some bad grammar in the Bible? Fine with us. That is not an error. All right, it's important to remember as well that it's not an error to tell what happened non-chronologically. Now, this takes a little bit of explanation because sometimes it can be an error, right? If the chronology is very important to the story, right, and you purposefully mix up the chronology in order to get something or to tell a lie, then it can be an error, obviously. But to tell a story in a non-chronological way isn't necessarily an error. I'll give you an example. Let's go back to that car accident that your friend got in, right? Blue car, not a black car. Let's say your friend is telling you about the accident and they want to tell you about everybody who rushed to the scene and to help you. Somebody found out about it on the news and they rushed to the scene. Somebody else, you texted them and they came over to help you from the next neighborhood over. So maybe they want to list everybody who helped you, and then they also want to list everybody who contacted you, maybe texted or emailed or called you on the phone. So maybe they want to give you two different lists, but let's say possibly these things happened, right? Somebody called, then somebody came over, and then somebody texted, and then somebody emailed, and then somebody came over. And so these things happened chronologically, but they don't give you the order chronologically. They give you the order more in categories. These are the people that came over. These are the people that contacted me. And you want to accuse them of saying something in error or lying, but maybe they're telling you the story in categories instead of chronologically because it's more simple, it's easier to communicate, and they want to make a certain point by it. And the chronology would actually be more messy. So telling something out of chronological order isn't necessarily an error. Next, moving on, we just have a few left. It's important to remember that it's not an error to round numbers. Classic example, a lot of people have pointed out that it seems the Bible here is given some building instructions, and it seems to indicate or imply that pi is 3, the number 3. So a lot of people throughout history have pointed out, hey, that's an error because we know pi isn't 3. We know pi is 3.14 on and on and on and on. However, it's not an error for ancient people to round pi to 3. That was all that was really necessary for the building projects that they were doing at that time, at least. And so we would not consider that an error. And this is just one example. But round numbers aren't necessarily an error. And as you know, unless you're going to sit there and quote pi forever, you always have to round it at some point. All right, moving on. We're not saying with the doctrine of inerrancy that everything should be taken literally. It shouldn't. There's all sorts of things in the Bible that are obviously shouldn't be taken literally. The Bible often says that God has a strong arm, but it's talking in a poetic type of phraseology. We don't think God literally has an arm. He's spiritual in that sense. He doesn't have a body. Now, as you know, Christians disagree about what should be taken literally and what shouldn't. Usually it's fairly obvious, sometimes it's not. Parables are one of those things that virtually nobody takes literally. Because it's fairly obvious when you come across a parable that the person, usually Jesus, but there's others that tell parables in the Bible, are telling a fictional story, not to be taken literally, but a fictional story that teaches truth, a spiritual or a moral point. So just another example of something that is fairly obvious, shouldn't be taken literally. Now, I want to give you guys one last question to discuss at your table. Oh, I lied. I made an error. I have one more question. But here's a question I want you to discuss now. Since we all agree that fictional stories can teach truth, stories that aren't literally true, can teach truth, could we not conclude that the whole Bible is simply a fictional parable that teaches moral and spiritual truth? We all agree that parables can do that. Why not maybe the whole Bible is just one big parable? Not to be taken literally, but teaches spiritual and moral truth. So how would you respond to that? I'll let you chew on it at your table. All right. You know, I would actually be okay with this. I would be okay with, viewing the entire Bible as just one big parable if that's what the Bible said about itself. However, the Bible doesn't seem to indicate that it is trying to communicate it is one big parable. In fact, several places, when it does record parables, certainly you can tell that, but the vast majority of places seems fairly obvious that it's making claims about reality, that it's making claims about what actually happened in history by listing years, listing historical figures that we know about from other historical sources. There's a lot of indications that the authors were not intending their work to be taken as fictional parables. So authorial intent, I think, is the big thing here. What did the authors intend their work to be taken as? Literal history or fictional parables? Imagine how frustrated you would be. Let's say you've written an excellent book on the history of slavery in America, right? And you've done your work, you've laid it out with all your historical sources, and you've laid out your work here about the history of slavery in America, and a group of people take it and say, oh, this is that wasn't your intent. Your intent was to actually give true, real history. You'd be very frustrated with that group, I would imagine. So I think the same sort of respect should be given to the biblical authors. What was their intent? Were they intending to write, this 66 books that should be taken as fictional parables or literal history? All right, a couple more left. It's important to remember that it's not an error for God to change his commands. It's not an error when God changes his commands. I'll give you an example. This is what people sometimes point out as an error. Just one simple example. In the Old Testament, God commanded the Israelites not to eat certain foods. Kosher is how we talk about it today, right? Don't eat pork, a lot of shellfish, all sorts of rules about foods in the Old Testament. But later, if all 66 books in the Bible are really from God, then later God says that those commands no longer apply. And that's not an error. God certainly has the right to command different things to different people, or different things to the same group of people at different points in history. I use the example often of some of these neutral things like foods, ceremonial aspects of worship, things that aren't necessarily good or evil in and of themselves, but God chose to command a certain group at a certain time of history to do these things. I assume he had good reasons for it. And later he gives them different instructions. It's kind of like, hypothetically, let's say God commanded us in America to drive on the right side of the road. And he commanded those in the UK to drive on the left side of the road. Well, there's nothing inherently evil about either side, right? But maybe God would have good reasons to command these two people groups to do different things at different times. And that's not an error. Now, certainly we would think that there's some things that God could never change, right? Like the commands to love God and love others. Maybe there's more than that, I don't know. But certainly there are things that he can change, and that's not an error. Okay, let's wrap this up. Let's land the plane. Let's just kind of get to the brass tacks here, and maybe what you were expecting tonight to be all about. All of those supposed errors that people have claimed to have found in the Bible. What about those? It's important to consider these, right? Because even though inerrancy can't be proven inductively, as we've talked a lot about, it can be disproven inductively, right? Does that make sense? A lot of the statements we can't prove because we just can't verify empirically, but the statements that could be approved or disproved inductively, if they were disproven, then inerrancy could be defeated. So it's very important, and it's necessary for those who defend inerrancy to consider all of these potential errors, and people, when they claim to have found errors, for us to evaluate them one by one. And that's a lot of work. But it's work that should be done, needs to be done, and has been done. So what we did tonight is we began, as most Christians do, with the deductive argument. And what I'm saying here is then we need to evaluate each of these potential objections inductively, one at a time. But certainly we couldn't do that in one night. And I don't even think you could do that in one semester. It's a lot of work. And I'm thankful for those who specialize in it. So here's a book that I own, and there's others out there. But this is a book by Norman Geisler and not Richard Howe, but his brother Thomas Howe. And it's called When Critics Ask, a Popular Handbook on Bible Difficulties. And it basically just goes from Genesis to Revelation. So it's easy to find things in that sense. The potential errors about Genesis are at the beginning, and the potential errors about Revelation are towards the end. And this is part of the work that they've done, is all of these potential errors they've evaluated inductively and tried to show how they're in reality not errors at all. But that's the type of work that needs to be done here. And I'll send this around. You can take a look at it if you want. Look up your favorite supposed error and see what they have to say. But these sort of resources are out there. And I didn't even think it was worthwhile to begin addressing them because it is a very large task. And if you ask me any in the Q&A, I'll just pull the book back and flip through, and hopefully it'll be in there. We'll do questions here in just a little bit. All right. I haven't researched every error claim. I don't know if anybody has, honestly. However, the ones that I have researched, the ones I have looked into, I have not found very compelling. But here's the last discussion question of the night. We'll be done in about 5 minutes. I want you guys to discuss this for 3 minutes, and then I'll talk for 2 minutes, and we'll be done. But what if, let's say, through this inductive aspect of inerrancy, we do come across something that we find very compelling that actually is an error in the Bible? So let's discuss that hypothetical. What would you do? How would you respond if tomorrow, let's say, somebody presented you evidence overwhelming evidence that the Bible, in fact, does have an error. All of these sort of resources don't have a good explanation. In fact, the explanation for the error is just a million times better, and you become convinced, let's say, that the Bible does have an error. What would you do in response? So I'll let you chat about that for a few minutes here. Now remember the question here. This is important. Remember the question. It's not, are we going to find an error or not? That's not the question. The question in this hypothetical situation is that we have found an error. Through whatever means, however we came to that conclusion, in this hypothetical situation, we have found an error. The question is, what would you do in response to that? I would answer it this way. I would say it depends. I would say it depends on if it's a minor error or a major error. If it's a minor error, right, I would just adopt a position akin to C.S. Lewis's. Yeah, the Bible is not inerrant. It does have some minor errors in it. Like my friend, when she told me about her car accident, she said the car was black instead of blue. She made a mistake. Doesn't mean her whole story's wrong. It's just she made a mistake. However, if it was a major error, like if somehow it was proven Jesus' resurrection was false, then I would say that Christianity itself is false. That would be my response. Well, a little bit of foreshadowing here, a little bit of getting you excited for things to come. In a couple weeks, Ben Blowers is going to address a very specific error claim. We haven't done that much yet. I've given you a whole book about it, I guess. But here at Ratio Christi, we haven't, taken all of these error claims and tried to address them. It's important work, and I appreciate people who do that sort of work. We can't do that for the entire semester, but we can give you resources if you're interested in that. But Ben, I'm very thankful, is going to address one of these very specific error claims, and the error claim is this. Some people claim that the Bible includes not historical errors, but moral errors. In other words, they say the Bible can't be true because it teaches immoral things. It even records God doing immoral things. So says the claim. Therefore, the Bible can't be true. So these aren't necessarily what we were talking about tonight in terms of historical accuracy, but maybe it's moral accuracy. So I'm very excited for Ben to address that type of error.